And welcome to August, everybody. August 1st, Tuesday, episode 259 of the 359 podcast. And in the house today, Alfred, Ben Fox Rubin, and Dara Kerr. Thank you so much for joining us.
First time for Dara Kerr. Thanks for being here.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
And by the way, happy anniversary, honey. I know you don't watch the show, but it's been a wonderful 7 years. So wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed these last 7 years, Ben.
I know, we've grown together. It's been so lovely. Anyway, we've got two interesting exclusives and scoops that we had on CNET today that we're going to get through on the podcast. First up, Dara just got back from a trip from Africa. She's going to talk about an Uber story that she wrote about with Rich Nieva, and Alfred is here to talk about Blue Phone's troubles with Amazon. Anyway, without further ado, we'll get to the main podcast. Send in your questions and comments, and Brian will get to as many as he can at the end of the show.
And here we go for the recording in 3, 2...
Welcome to the 359. I'm Ben Fox Rubin.
I'm Alfred.
And with us today is Uber reporter Dara Kerr. Dara, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So Dara, you just got back from a reporting trip in Africa where you reported on Uber hiring a security company to protect drivers from getting attacked there. How did you hear about this?
Well, I was there with our colleague, Rich Nieva, and also another colleague, James Martin, who's a photographer for CNET. And we decided to take some Uber rides and see what was happening on the ground in Johannesburg. And the more drivers we talked to, the more we heard about this violence that's happening between taxi drivers and Uber drivers.
So it's gotten so bad, actually, that Uber hired armed security guards to station in certain, of the busiest areas.
Right. So violence between taxis and Uber drivers isn't isolated to South Africa. It's happened all over the world. But what's happening in South Africa is pretty extreme violence. Some people have been killed, they're hospitalized, there's been beatings with iron and sticks and bricks. And so to quell the violence, Uber has hired this private security company, quietly hired. Yeah.
So why are the taxi drivers so upset about the Uber drivers? I'm assuming that it's mostly the taxi drivers that are the aggressors in this situation.
Right. Yeah, the taxi drivers feel that Uber is stealing their jobs. The cost to take an Uber is far less than a taxi, and so taxis just can't compete. So they're really upset that they're losing their jobs and their livelihood. Another thing is to be an Uber driver, you have to have a certain kind of car, has to be 2013 or newer, 4 doors, air conditioning, and a lot of poor people in South Africa can't afford to even lease a car like that. So there's a slight discrimination happening.
For the Uber drivers, especially because the violence has really amped up, have you heard from them that they want to move away from being Uber drivers altogether? I mean, I'm sitting here thinking, how is this worth it to keep doing?
Right. Yeah. No, a lot of Uber drivers we've talked to said they have all these kind of safety measures in place. They're really on guard when they drop people off if there's not the security company there. And some Uber drivers we talked to said they have friends that have quit because it's just too dangerous. It's scary.
Yeah, thanks for writing that story. It was really interesting read. Also, Alfred, you came out with a story today that Amazon, or actually it was yesterday, Amazon suspended sales of Blue phones over potential security concerns. Get us up to speed on that.
Yeah, so this broke out last week during Black Hat on Thursday. The security company called CryptoWire had discovered that a certain number of Blue phones were still using 8UP's firmware, which in November this got discovered by CryptoWire, where basically this firmware was sending very personal data on your phone to servers in China. It was never specified what it was being used for while it was on those servers, but it would send data like your phone number, apps you used, how often you use these apps, your MAC address, cell phone tower data in some scenarios where they can find out what your location is. And they weren't exactly informing their users. It was in their privacy policy, is essentially a section that nobody reads.
Yeah.
And it got to a point. So that happened in November. And then when that happened, Blue basically said, we didn't know about this. We've gotten rid of it. It's gone now. We really, value our users' privacy.
However,
so last week at Black Hat, CryptoWire at their presentation basically said, That's not true. We found these phones in May that still have this firmware on it, and it's still exfiltrating data to these servers in China, and they aren't notifying users when their personal information gets lost. So yesterday, we found out that Amazon actually ended up suspending the sales of Blue phones, which is a heavy hit for both Amazon and Blue, considering that Blue phones were really known for their cheap prices on Amazon, and it was the top-selling phone on Amazon's market.
I mean, like one of them sells for like $50 or $60.
Yeah.
Like this is a cheap phone.
Yeah, and it was also their top-selling phone, and now it's the sales have been suspended until they figure out what's going on with Blue's security concerns and privacy concerns for a lot of people.
Right. So in the meantime, do you think it's a good idea for people to buy Blue phones until this whole thing gets figured out?
I can't suggest for what people should buy, but I mean, I wouldn't take the bet.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, if you want to read more about these stories, check us out on CNET. I'm Ben Fox Rubin.
I'm Alfred.
And Dara, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks.
I don't think you have to worry about anybody being delving into the Blue phones if I'm reading the comment section correctly today.
Really?
Yeah.
So it's
there's-
Blue, by the way, BLU.
BLU.
If you're only listening to this on audio. And
well,
sometimes
we're on YouTube
like
now.
yeah,
So-
but it's sometimes like that cheap is a little too good to be true, I suppose. I mean, like I was pretty surprised that at how low that
I mean,
price was.
the reason why they can afford it for it to be that cheap though is because the firmware that I was talking about, ADUPS, that's only usually found on cheap phones, and like that's because their service is cheap as well. You know, when you're buying a phone, you're not just buying like the hardware. There's a lot of like software things that they have to pay for to use on it as well.
Yeah.
And ADUPS is relatively cheap, and that's like a large reason why.
I'd be curious to see what sort of things they would have to change to actually convince Amazon to like get back in their good
Yeah, I mean
graces.
when it happened, Amazon had also suspended their sales back in November when this first report came out, and I'm sure that they've made some adjustments to get back on the market and climb back onto the top of the charts. But
I
now,
didn't know that. They
Yeah.
also suspended
Yeah.
them back in November and then
Yeah,
they came back.
but now it's like fool me twice, can't get fooled again.
Anyway, on to the questions.
Yeah, I mean, besides the raving amount of I hate Blue phones going through the
Ouch.
chat, we'd love to actually hear some feedback from those who maybe have driven for Uber, such as our friend Matthew Datcher. Datch, what's up?
Hey, Matthew.
He says, I drove Uber briefly a couple of years ago, didn't fear for my safety, actually met some interesting people. The worst were the drunk 20-somethings. But Matthew, could you actually tell us, remind us where about you are in the world again, and if anybody else at the same time has had any other experiences driving for Uber and have had safety concerns themselves in a related sense, we'd love to hear about them. Meanwhile, Dara, could you expand a little bit on what you're seeing develop as this continues to unfold?
Yeah, you mean with the private security company?
Right.
Yeah, so we had heard Uber drivers talking about this private security company, so we actually tried to track them down and found them. And indeed, there were guards at these dangerous drop-off spots, which tended to be busy train stations and other bus stations, other busy areas. So the guards, they wouldn't talk to us. They said they weren't allowed to talk to us, and we couldn't take their picture. But they were fairly menacing looking. They were really nice, but they were
armed?
all the Uber drivers said they were armed. When we asked them if they were carrying a gun, they said they couldn't disclose that.
All right. Good that you didn't take pictures of them.
Yeah, I know that
Yeah.
you couldn't take photos of them, but can you describe kind of what they looked like?
Yeah, so they were wearing all black military gear, so combat boots, what are those pants with the pockets? On the
Cargo
pants.
yeah. Bulletproof vests.
Bulletproof that gets
Yeah.
to that level.
Right. And the
Yeah.
black beanies too,
Black
right? So like they
beanies.
kind of look like green berets almost.
And they had a little thing of mace in the pocket of their bulletproof vest.
I know that we're looking at this from like a security for the drivers kind of point of view, but is anyone else like kind of like creeped out by the fact that Uber has the capacity to legally hire a their own private security like armed force in like another country? That's kind of creepy, right? Like that's
I mean, like it's a private company. I guess. I hear where you're getting
Armed,
at, but at
armed
the
to
same
that
time,
level, like we're a private company. We don't have people with like potential like guns and bulletproof vests like at our offices all the time.
Yes,
Obviously,
but
we're
it
not
would
facing
be-
those kind of like dangers.
that's
but
true.
It's
That's
weird.
True.
It's,
and
it's
and if I was, would I continue
Imagine-
working at
yeah.
CNET? I don't know.
I agree with you, Alfred. It seems a little weird. It's like the oil companies that have
Yeah.
these militia that guard their oil tanks
Mm-hmm.
and oil lines. But what's interesting, I think, also is that this is more of a band-aid to the problem for the violence. It doesn't get to the root problem why the taxi drivers are causing the violence, which is this desperation because they're losing their jobs and their income.
yeah.
So, I mean, the taxi drivers said they've asked Uber to have the same rates as them, but that hasn't happened yet.
It feels like Uber is just kind of responding to force with more force as opposed to like the underlying issue, like you said.
Right, and lots of taxi drivers said that. They said, Uber's just bringing more violence by having these armed guards.
Yeah. Looking at this a little bit more broadly, we talked about this before the podcast, that like while you were at the Daily News, you wrote about, violence relating to Uber drivers in New York too,
yeah.
right? So like this is in a lot of places.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but it wasn't like an all-out war between taxi drivers and Uber drivers. It was just a lot of people were targeting Uber drivers at the time because they were easy to like steal from, and they had nicer cars and all this stuff, and you were guaranteed to at least get a smartphone out of it, kind of thing.
Yeah,
Ugh.
yeah, and that's what's happening in Nairobi, is more, but they're just gnarly tales that we heard, of people being locked in their trunks and driven out to the bush and stripped clean. Yeah.
Kevin in the chat has a question. For the record, we're podcasting out of New York, but Dara, you're from San Francisco.
Right.
He asked, didn't you guys have your own Uber problems in SF? I remember hearing about a driver going berserk on the passengers, taking a hammer out and hitting passengers on the head.
Yeah.
I never heard about that.
Yeah,
Could you fill us in?
Yeah, I covered that story and worked with the lawyer representing the victim. Yeah, that was a crazy story. This driver, he just was a little off and started driving these passengers not on the route they were going to. And so they asked to be let out, and he just went after them with a hammer and hit. I mean, he severely injured one of the passengers, hit him in the eye. He lost an eye.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
I know. It was crazy.
I don't even know how to respond to that.
I know. Yeah.
They're like, that's not like the only story as far as that's concerned, right? Like Uber has had these problems come up a lot because they're
Right.
growing so quickly.
Yeah.
Sometimes like they'll get bad apples
And
coming
as
in
far
and
as-
becoming drivers.
As far as like this security firm goes itself, I mean, you had to go all the way, out there to basically find out about it through Uber drivers. I mean, why do you think this is something that Uber kind of wants to, keep a secret?
It's not good publicity, and that the Uber drivers are dying. I mean, people have died, and it also doesn't make people want to be Uber drivers, and that's Uber's big goal is to get more. The more drivers it gets, the easier it is for it to compete and take over.
Yeah, and I know you were mentioning a bit earlier that these drivers, they were telling you about they're very vigilant when they're driving and they're looking around when they're like dropping off passengers and things like that. So even with this like extra security, do you think that they feel safe at all?
They said it does help.
Okay.
They said it's gotten better with the security guards, and I have to say this train station that we were at where we found the guards is not the safest train station, but that block felt very safe. And the guard, he told us, you're perfectly safe on this block, and I believed him.
How
that
many guards
usually
were
makes
there?
me feel safe.
We counted 4 or 5.
And that was just at that one station?
Right.
In that one block of that
Right.
one station.
Right.
Yeah.
So what happens if you're inside the train station and you hail an Uber, the app will direct you to that block. Because right outside the train station is the taxi stand, and the Ubers used to stop there, but because of the violence, they now have to stop a block away. And so the app will direct you to that block, and then there's where the guards are.
Do you know if the app is, do you know if those guards were only specifically for Uber? Like if there was some other, kind of chaos breaking down, they wouldn't get involved, right? Like if it was between 2 taxi drivers or something.
Right. It's unclear what would happen. They're working for Uber.
Okay.
So, but they seem like the kind of people that would want to quell any violence.
I gotta wonder how many elements are at play here, because there's a lot of variables. Is it partially geolocation? Is it the spiraling corporate corruption of Uber itself? Is it just intense competition since it's not localized to only one location? However, we are focusing on a very specific incident that's happening in South Africa as we speak. I just wonder how many elements are truly at play here and what they can do about. I mean, they can have security, but is that really going to fix this? No.
Yeah, that's going back to this whole thing where security is a band-aid for the problem. This to me, this boils down to competition. Uber is trying to win in this market, and that means taking over taxi drivers' business. I don't know if Uber would say that, but that's what's happening. Otherwise, why would they be undercutting at a loss?
Yeah.
And that's what's happening around the world, and that's why you see these desperate taxi drivers everywhere getting upset.
Yeah. There was also another element that you kind of ended your story with that let's talk a bit about that. You were talking about how there's now created this kind of separation between who uses taxis versus who uses Ubers.
Right. And in South Africa, that's, you feel segregation really strongly because of its history with apartheid. But taxi drivers told us that white people don't take taxis anymore.
So they're generally taking Ubers because they're newer cars. They can utilize the app, which makes it a little bit easier to hail.
You can charge your phone, get gum, water. Taking an Uber's nice. The drivers are nice. It's very professional. The taxi drivers can, it's kind of like New York City. Like, you don't know what you're going to get. And I mean, for me, that's kind of fun. But there's, one Uber driver was complaining of taxis, like, you get in the taxi and you can look down and there's a hole in the floor and you can see the road. They're just like, they're rundown cars.
And it's more expensive.
Right.
So one could argue that it's a worse service that's more expensive.
Right.
But at the same time, Uber is undercutting the price at a loss.
Right.
So it's not a sustainable model for them.
And exactly. And at the same time, you can only take an Uber if you have a smartphone and credit card. So there's that kind of discrimination happening, class discrimination.
Just to bring a little levity back to the conversation, hey, maybe the hole in the floor, as they say with all the things wrong with the iPhone, that's not a bug, that's a feature.
Yeah, it's nice to see the road.
It's the
Flintstone car.
negative sunroof.
It's air conditioning.
Yeah, right.
From the ground. Yeah.
Sorry, we had to lighten it up a little bit.
Right.
That's
that
a heavy
was
conversation.
an interesting. I didn't want to get to that in the 4-minute portion, but it was definitely an interesting element that you heard from people on the ground. So I did want to address
Right,
that.
yeah.
So yeah, it was, and to me that's interesting element and another part of the story.
Well, when that taxi driver told me that, it really brought it home for me how hard the situation is that this Western company has created, and
that seems to be the story around the world for them, especially I know in China with Didi, like that they kind of messed things up a lot there too, because they had a whole system going on with the amount of rideshare drivers that they had for Didi.
Right. Yeah. And in a lot of other countries, there's all sorts of forms of transportation, motorcycles, bicycles, tuk-tuks. So it's weird. It's literally disrupting.
It's almost as if you can't take one country's culture and just implant it somewhere else.
Oh, that's weird.
You don't say.
Yeah.
Who would have thought?
I'm shocked. All right, do we have any other questions? Or
I think Kevin is just wondering, or I'm sorry if I'm misquoting here. No, Evan. Sorry, Evan is wondering if other
Vault.
elements at play could help this. What about things like cameras in cars? And I'm kind of curious, are there any other services besides Uber? Is there Lyft in the area? Is there anything else?
Lyft is U.S. only, if I remember
US
correctly.
only.
Yeah.
There are local services. There's one called Taxify.
Sounds like they do
I don't know
taxes.
if Taxify is in South Africa. It's definitely in Nairobi. There's one called Zebra, which I was corrected. It's Zebra.
Oh,
Yeah. So, and that they're in South Africa. I think they. Well, I don't know if they're an African company, but there are other competitors. But Uber definitely is the big.
Yeah, my question about that though was let's say Taxify, a Taxify driver comes through. I'm sure the cabbies there also would hate them.
Yeah.
And if that person's getting attacked, would the Uber guards kind of stop that, or is it kind of well, he's not an Uber driver, so sorry, kind of
I would assume the guards would help out because they seem like those. But who knows? I don't know what their agreement is with Uber and if they're not supposed to get involved in anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. That's probably the way
Cool.
we're going to have to leave it off for the day.
Yeah.
We're running out of time.
No, we
but
can't.
as always, keep the stream of conscious in the comments section, and we'll, of course, link out to the story, and this will be ever developing on CNET. And thanks,
Yeah.
as always, for joining us. And
Great.
Dara, thanks for coming along.
Yeah, thanks.
yeah,
This is,
thanks.
fascinating story. Thanks for talking
Thank
about
you.
Nice to have someone
Yeah.
besides these schmucks here.
it. Hey, all right. You're right, though. Now let's bring it home.
All right.
I come back to this.
359 is available on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, SoundCloud, FeedBurner, Google Play Music, and
It's on CNET.com.
of
if
course
you've
it's
heard
on
of it.
CNET. Thanks everybody for watching. We'll be back tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye.